If I could please have you take your seats, we're going to go ahead and get started so that we can keep to our schedule. So first of all, hello and welcome to the 27th Annual Pundits Forum. I'm Karen Sonder. I'm the current president of City Club of Boise. I'm the most virtual president that this club has ever had, and maybe the only virtual president. So we're very, very excited to have you here to kick off our 2022 season and this great annual event. So before we get started, I would like to recognize our board of directors and committee members. These are all volunteers who are dedicated to the City Club of Boise and our mission. If you're here, please stand. And I know some of you are attending virtually, and I'll trust that you're standing at home as well. So let's give them a round of applause and a thank you to our board members. So thank you. Thank you, thank you. So events don't put themselves on, and we have a very dedicated staff of two at the City Club, Neva Geisler and Morgan Keating, who just really do an outstanding job for the club, and I appreciate them immensely. So thank you to you, both of you, for what you do. I know we've got some elected officials in the audience, both in person and virtual. We thank you for your service to our community and our state. We really appreciate it. So we'd also like to acknowledge the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territory of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute people on which we are meeting today. We'll also have close to 60 students from local high schools, from Boise, Bora, and Capital High Schools. Thank you for being here today. We invite you to become engaged in the conversation. We at City Club are able to offer many students to come to our events because of the very generous donations by our members and supporters. Please consider making a donation to our Landmark Fund so we can continue this fabulous tradition. So the City Club of Boise was founded in 1995 by Dottie Stimson. Dottie felt that Boise needed a venue where citizens could learn about and discuss important issues of the day in a nonpartisan, civil manner. Our motto, things happen when people start talking, we've added the words and listening. So City Club has long been a leader in promoting civility. Over the past 27 years, we've had the wonderful opportunity to offer a vast array of forums, tours, salons, and evening conversations. As with many organizations, we pivoted in 2020 to offer our virtual conversations. I'm really pleased to tell you that we had close to 9,000 attendees and viewers over the past 2 years. Everybody was there supporting us. And the continued commitment and support of our members and sponsors, we were able to keep the lights on, so thank you. With that, I'd like to acknowledge our many sponsors. Our premier sponsor for 2022 is Northwest Nazarene University and NNU School of Business. Our annual sponsor is University of Idaho, Boise. Today's program is sponsored by Strategies 360, so thank you for your support. Bank of Idaho, Echelon Group, and Red Sky have tables here today. Boise State University, University of Idaho, and the BSU School of Public Service and Holly Truxell are joining us from their virtual tables. It's a strange time, isn't it? We also receive grant funding from the Idaho Humanities Council and state-based affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please indulge me while I thank a few more sponsors. This is how we're able to keep the lights on and continue to deliver quality programming. We also thank our university partners, Boise State University, Northwest Nazarene University, and NNU College of Business. Our media sponsors are Idaho Statesman, Idaho Public Television, and Boise State Public Radio. Forum series sponsors are AARP Idaho, Bank of Idaho, Echelon Group, Micron, Optum Idaho, Pacific Source Health Plans, and Small Mine Development. Sponsors, we thank you for your continued commitment. We thank you, so please acknowledge them. I also want to do a shout out to the Boise Center. Isn't this wonderful that they've been able to help us do these hybrid events and really work hard, and it looks great. So thank you, Boise Center. I will remind you, City Club of Boise is a membership-driven organization, and we'd like to also thank our individual and corporate members. For more information on membership, please visit our website, cityclubofboise.org. Our forums are broadcast on Boise State Public Radio 91.5 FM. And you can always view past programs on the City Club's own YouTube channel. So that's pretty new this year. So we encourage you to sign up and watch those there. Now, please silence your cell phones, get your question cards ready, and welcome today's moderator, longtime City Club member and former board member, Kevin Richert. So thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you, Karin, and thank you all for joining us either here or out there somewhere. You know, I don't think of this hybrid format as a workaround. What this really is part of City Club's 2-year plan to move back to real live pundits panels. So look forward to 2023. It's going to be amazing. I mean, really, I wish we all were in the same room here for this program, because I love talking about politics, and City Club loves to get 500 or 600 very smart people in the same room to talk about politics. And there's just so much to talk about right now with this legislative session and with this election year just getting underway. But there is one benefit to the hybrid format. We're going to be able to connect with people from outside of the Treasure Valley, and we're still going to give you the best Pundits Forum experience we can, with your help, of course. One of the best things about this forum is the Q&A. So get your questions ready, your question cards here in the audience, and if you're on Zoom, please use the Q&A function. We will keep an eye out for your questions. This is about the most 2022 forum we could put together. This is a true hybrid format here. You know, we've got one pundit in person, we've got 2 virtually here. Let me introduce you to all 3. To my left is a longtime coworker, colleague, and friend, Clark Corbin. He is the State House reporter for the Idaho Capital Sun, which launched a little bit less than a year ago. Part of the reason we could have him here is that it isn't mountain climbing season, but it's great to have you here, Clark. Melissa Davlin is the host of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television. She is joining us virtually from our home, and I knew we would get a kid sighting, and maybe we'll get a pet cameo here in the next hour. You don't know what to expect when you have Melissa on virtually on anything, but we also expect expertise from her and from all of the pundits. Betsy Russell is no stranger to this forum, no stranger to any of you. She is the Boise Bureau Chief. She is the State Capitol reporter for the Idaho Press, the author of the Eye on Boise blog, and it looks like she is joining us virtually. Are you at the State House?
I am. I'm in the Capitol press room.
So we won't get a pet cameo from the State House press room unless it's a really cool day in the press room, and I wish I was there. So let's get started here. Usually when we do a forum like this, we wind up waiting until the very end to ask the question on everybody's minds, how long is this session going to go on anyway? But I feel like this time we almost have to do this backwards. I mean, we can't have another 311-day legislative session this year, can we? I mean, that can't possibly occur. And in some ways, it feels like it's moving fairly quickly. Betsy, why don't you jump in and tell us the story so far? And some things are moving fairly significantly, you know, big bills moving quickly.
Absolutely. I mean, the biggest tax cut bill in Idaho state history has already emerged from committee in the House and passed the House and zoomed over to the Senate, where it's awaiting its hearing there. It is remarkable speed. Normally, the legislature doesn't do a heck of a lot in its first 3 weeks other than review administrative rules, which is a big, voluminous task, and they are doing that as well. But the House also has passed the teacher health insurance bill, an initiative of the governors, a bill that Representative Rod Furness from Eastern Idaho has been working on for 4 years. That's a huge investment for the state and a major, a lot of people have used the words transformational, game changer, step in how Idaho compensates its teachers. It was really interesting during the debate this week to hear all the legislators say, you know, teachers don't get the same health insurance that we do as legislators, and they probably should. And that's what this bill does. So yeah, we've seen major legislation move early. We've heard all kinds of pledges from the leadership that the session will be over by March 25th. I have to say, whenever I hear that, I always mentally add at least a week. So my current guess is April Fool's Day.
Okay, well, what can we add from that? Melissa, you've been watching this. What's been your observation, your takeaway the first 2.5 weeks?
I agree with Betsy that lawmakers really seem to have an eye on getting things done, getting them done quickly. We really saw that with the introduction of what will likely be the major tax legislation. And that's not to say we're not going to see more with property tax. I know that there are going to be attempts to get the grocery tax repeal a hearing at least, but this isn't the end of the conversation for taxes, but we are definitely going to see an expedited conversation because lawmakers want to get out of town and they want to start campaigning. And I'll leave it there.
Eli, a dissenting opinion there, big fella? No, never mind. Clark,
I have to tell you, I have to show this to you. Okay. I set notes in front of me, budget highlights and a couple other things. And the only thing that is keeping him quiet right now is letting him scribble all over them. I would not take that as commentary on any of Governor Little's budget proposals, but that's where we're at right now with working from home.
He writes on anything using any writing device. He's a journalist. I mean, that's what we do. I mean, he's ready. Clark, you watched that tax debate. We all kind of watched it on Thursday. It was an unusual tax debate on the House floor, wasn't it?
Kevin, I'm going to say that it was unusual, but at the end of the day, it was sort of this classic, predictable Idaho House moment where we had this 90-minute debate, strong feelings, and then we get a nearly party line vote to pass the thing. But it was unusual, and I like where you're going here because it's the largest tax cut in state history. A lot of people in the audience and listening today are familiar what it is, but it's a $600 million plan. It involves $350 million of tax rebates, and then it spends another $251 million to lower the income tax rate and lower the corporate income tax rate to 6%. So that's kind of the selling point behind it, but it was unusual because a lot of people who spoke, even some of the Republicans who voted in favor of it, kind of acted like maybe they would have rather had a property tax proposal in front of them. We heard talk about the property tax and the grocery tax, the sales tax on grocery in this debate, but that bill did neither one of those things. It was an income tax bill and rebate bill. So I think we had some fun the other day on the radio talking about how largest tax cut in state history, and some people kind of acted like they were holding their nose when they were voting for it, right?
Yeah, it was not a very enthusiastic debate. A lot of moments of, like you say, holding your nose. And it really begs a question here. We started out the session, we'll talk about it more, this $1.9 billion surplus, at least that's the latest projection, and it seems to change almost daily. Largest surplus in state history. This tax package, assuming it passes the Senate, which it almost certainly will, takes $600 million out of that equation if you're doing the rough math. Is this one and done on tax policy? Are there other tax bills coming? I mean, theoretically, there's money for a grocery tax repeal if the legislature were to decide to go that route, or property tax reform. What are your expectations, all three of you, on that?
Well, I mean, I'm hearing plenty of legislators talking about other bills, including a whole array of potential property tax bills. There's already been a personal bill introduced by Representative Ron Nate, which of course won't advance because personal bills in the House don't advance, but to remove the sales tax from groceries. There's a lot of talk. What we have not seen are a lot of proposals coming out. And in the House Revenue and Taxation Committee keeps a pretty tight rein on what actually gets a hearing to even be considered for introduction. to the point that last session, Representative Bruce Skog from Nampa had a very popular property tax bill with so many co-sponsors, it almost had a majority, or maybe it did, and it couldn't even get an introductory hearing. So a whole lot rests in the hands of the Rev and Tax Chairman, Representative Stephen Harris from Meridian, and the House leadership.
I don't think they can go home without addressing property tax at this point. That is one thing that we have heard across the board from everyone from very conservative Republicans to Democrats, everyone in between, saying we need to revisit the property tax bill that was passed last year, because people all over the state, this isn't a Treasure Valley problem. This isn't a rural Idaho problem. This is across the board. And I cannot imagine that lawmakers will be able to go home and defend not doing anything on property tax this year during the campaign.
Yeah, I agree with Betsy and Melissa. I think there'll be other efforts. I think this is something that legislators have heard from their constituents about for the last several years and heard about it this winter. It was something that came up in the new Boise State Public Policy Survey, the 7th survey that was just released last week, talked about that. So yeah, I think that there will be efforts for more tax relief this year. That was something that House Majority Leader Mike Moyle talked about. He thinks that there's money left over to pay for education, pay for transportation, and maybe still do more for taxes. Another thing that Representative Moyle said, though, is that the state and the state legislature neither collect nor spend property taxes. And so he said it's harder to get involved with that. I know a lot of legislators think there are options out there. So I think today was the 16th day of the session. I think we have a lot of time between now and March 25th, or between now and April 1st, Betsy's deadline. And I think there will be more efforts.
And Clark referenced the Boise State survey, which came out Friday, and I've read it. I've talked to one of the authors. It's always a fascinating study, and it always comes out in the first couple of weeks of the legislative session. These researchers know what they're doing. They know that if you want to do a survey of Idahoans about Idaho public policy, the best time to release it is right in the beginning of the public policy debate season. And I was struck, and maybe all three of you can chime in about this, I was struck by some of the responses we heard from Idahoans. I mean, definitely a strong sentiment about property tax relief and some definite concerns about the effects of growth, housing, and we've already got a question about housing. We'll discuss that further as we go this hour. Real concern about the direction the state is going. This narrowing gap between the percentage of Idahoans who say that the state is heading in the right direction as opposed to those who say it's not heading in the right direction. I thought it was kind of a reality check of a survey.
Absolutely. I think there are all kinds of interesting results in that survey, and I don't feel like I've delved into it as anywhere near as far as I'd like to at this point. One top line result that caught my eye was the extremely strong statewide support for full day kindergarten, for funding that from the state level, which is something we've also heard from the governor, from the state superintendent of schools, from the state board of education, and from a whole lot of legislators. Yeah. And that is right on the front burner for the legislature this year. And so they got a vote of confidence for taking that step. These other things, there's a whole lot to look at in that survey. One thing I was interested in and really don't know, I'd have to delve a lot further into it to figure it out, are what the survey had to say about the newcomers to the state and what the political views are that they bring to Idaho and how they change the political mix. And I thought it was really interesting that they did that polling, and I can't wait to find out more about it. Another surprising result, I thought, was that property tax relief and income tax cuts were almost statistically tied. Yeah. That almost as many people favored income tax cuts as did property tax relief in that study or in that survey, which is not what legislators say they've been hearing from their constituents. We have heard legislator after legislator say, not a single person has contacted me to say, cut income taxes, but I'm hearing from everybody about property taxes. So that's an interesting disconnect.
And really different than what we heard from Democrats during that debate on the House floor on Thursday. We had multiple Democrats debate against that bill saying, I'm not hearing from anybody who wants income tax relief, but everybody is upset about property taxes, and there are a lot of folks who are clamoring for grocery tax repeal. The survey comes up with a different result. Melissa, what jumped out at you about this survey and this tone and this direction that we're going?
Yeah, and I haven't had a chance to go into the survey as much as I would like. I've talked about this a little bit online. I have been in COVID isolation with my kids for just about 2 weeks now, because one kid will get it, and then another kid will get it, and then I got it, and then now my husband has it, and so it's been this interesting session for me because I have been watching online, but I've also had this personal crisis going on, right? Where, we lost childcare on the first day of the session. Our part-time babysitter quit right as the state of the state was being delivered. I got a text right during that hour-long speech. And so the conversations that I have been having with other parents, particularly working mothers, have been very, very different than what I have seen being talked about from lawmakers, for example, right? So I haven't had a chance to dig into this survey. I love it every year. But when you're talking about this gap between what Idahoans are concerned about and what's happening with lawmakers, it's something that I'm really experiencing on a personal level right now, because what my fellow moms are talking about is the lack of childcare. What we're talking about is concern about COVID in schools. And, regardless of how you feel about masks or vaccines, that aside, my oldest has been out of school now for a week and a half because he just can't kick this cough. And so, no matter what, we're distance learning. And that's been a huge strain for me as a worker who's trying to cover the session. And I think that gap, we see that every year. That's nothing new. But as I'm talking to other parents right now, that gap really seems to be huge. Childcare is such a concern for working parents right now. My sister-in-law just had to turn down a job because she couldn't find childcare at the same time as these hours. That's affecting the workforce. That's affecting our ability to pay for rising housing costs and rising cost of living, everything across the board. I'm really curious if those topics are going to come up during the session. And I really do look forward to digging into that public policy survey.
Well, let's stay on that topic quickly, because this is the Omicron session, whether we want to face that or not. We've had, several lawmakers have reported tested positive. At least 2 State House reporters have reported testing positive. And, we're at a time, the session is chugging along at the same time that Southern Idaho hospitals are back under crisis standards of care. Schools are scrambling to figure out how to stay open. It feels like in our day job at Idaho Education News, we're updating status on school closures or school reopenings. How is this variant and how is this surge going to affect this session? Is it going to be an uninterrupted session? Is it going to affect debates over pandemic protocols, public health protocols? Who wants to give me a sense of what they think is going to happen with the Omicron session?
Well, I know that whenever I make a prediction, there's a good chance I'll be wrong, so I try to avoid it. But I had the sense for the first week and a half that we were just barreling towards a COVID shutdown. And now I'm not so sure. I mean, COVID is rampant. I think that, there are hundreds of tests being done each day of people in the Capitol. I think there are a whole lot of people who are testing positive, but are either just staying away quietly for a few days and coming back. Maybe they'll just roll right through. I think that makes a big difference in the session. If there's a sudden and unanticipated shutdown right in the middle of the action, as there was last year, I think it can take the wind out of the sails of a lot of major proposals. And, we can go back to the idea of the income tax cut having passed and that there's still space for all these other debates on other types of tax relief. Well, if there were an extended COVID shutdown and then it was getting on the primary campaign season, the legislators might just want to shut it down and go campaign. And all we would get would be income tax cuts. I don't know what to expect. These are strange times indeed, aren't they?
You heard it here first. These are strange times.
I don't know what to
Clark.
expect either, but there's a handful of like really bizarre scenarios that could play out. We don't know what's going to happen with Omicron or with the virus, but certainly last year during the 2021 legislative session, there was a recess where there was a COVID outbreak in the Idaho House and the legislature had to shut down. And it did kind of grind things to a halt. And I think things were maybe more difficult. I'm not a legislator, but I think things were maybe more difficult when they came back after that break. There's also a scenario where if this redistricting plan gets tossed out by the Idaho Supreme Court, that could affect whether we're having the primary election on time, which is scheduled for May 17th. Basically, the thing to look for is what the Supreme Court decides on the redistricting plan and whether or not we're able to have that basically confirmed and in place by about February 28th is when the candidate filing period comes open. And the Supreme Court just heard arguments earlier this week
lawsuits in front of them
about multiple lawsuits. And one of the attorneys got into this, that if you're an incumbent, or certainly if you're a challenger, you cannot know which office you're eligible to run for until these new political maps have this cloud lifted over them. And so the Supreme Court is either going to weigh in on whether the maps are legal and can remain in place, or they may say one or more of the maps, being the legislative map or the congressional map, may be illegal, may violate Idaho law, may violate the Idaho Constitution. And if they do that, and if they appoint a whole new redistricting commission, that could really be interesting. But if that happens, and if there's a COVID delay or a recess or an outbreak in the House, things could really get unpredictable in a hurry, knowing that this is an election year, knowing there's so much uncertainty out there still. But that's like a worst case scenario. So it doesn't have to go that way, right, Kevin?
All scenarios are on the table. It's only the third week of the session.
Right.
Let's start to dive into some questions, because we're starting to get questions from the audience and we're starting to get questions over Zoom. And I'm going to try to combine a couple that address property taxes and property taxes for education. One questioner is saying, well, if the legislature were to properly and adequately fund education and we could eliminate the need for supplemental property tax levies for education, which are now $218 million this year, another record, wouldn't that be a substantial contribution to property tax relief? And I'll throw in a side question that's related. Is there any interest in the legislature in the idea of allowing impact fees for schools?
Well, on
That's a
the
big
budget
thing.
question, the governor's budget proposes a $300 million increase in the public school budget for K through 12 schools. Now, that's more than the total amount of supplemental levies. On the other hand, that has components within it that are statutorily required to be spent for certain things. It is not a one-to-one offset, but it's an 11% proposed increase to school funding. It is significant as heck. Oh my gosh, I forgot the other question.
Impact fees, school impact fees.
Oh, school impact fees. So I don't understand why the legislature has never shown any interest in considering that. I think it's pretty popular. It's been proposed frequently. I have never even seen it come up for a hearing or a bill be introduced. And I'm not sure why not. I mean, this is one of those things that local governments are advocating for. There's a sense that when you're in a high growth period, growth should pay for growth.
Mm-hmm.
And impact fees are one way that does that. But in Idaho, we're very limited on the way we utilize impact fees. Pretty much it's just for roads. And we don't do it for schools. And who could change that? The legislature. But they have not considered.
And we have a bill kicking around that would address supplemental levies directly and try to phase out supplemental levies. Are there any prospects on that bill, or is it a discussion item right now as opposed to an actual bill with a chance of passing?
I was going to let you take the lead on that one, because I know that if you want to take moderator's privilege, because I know that you followed it closely at Idaho Education.
No. I'm throwing the question out. Betsy, it's Jim Rice. It's the chairman of local government taxation committee, one of the legislators you watch closely. He's been talking about this for several years.
He has indeed, and I've seen him haunting the hallways on the House side, trying to get in to see House Majority Leader Mike Moyle to talk about it. But at this point, I think it is more of a discussion thing than it is a bill. We certainly haven't seen a bill introduced. I think that, Melissa's right. There will be property tax legislation this year. They have to fix what they screwed up, basically, in House Bill 389. And even the author, Representative Moyle of the bill, acknowledges that. But how far those changes go, how far those fixes go, is very uncertain at this point. And we've seen proposals from local governments across the state saying, repeal that whole thing, do something entirely different. Nothing's out there yet.
Let me ask you this question, and this is also in the context of this $1.9 billion surplus. What are the odds, this questioner asks, what are the odds of actual work taking place in regards to affordable housing, especially for Idahoans on low and moderate incomes or fixed incomes? Is there any possibility the legislature will address this issue?
I actually think there will be some steps taken on affordable housing this year. The governor has proposed tapping the ARPA funds, which is the American Rescue Plan Act, the federal funds that we're getting, in order to fund something like, but not exactly, the state's housing trust fund. And the idea is to provide some kind of gap financing for affordable housing developers, which apparently is really lacking in the markets in Idaho for developing this kind of housing. So I do think that there's something out there that definitely will be proposed and may well fly to tap into federal funds for that. There has only been one housing bill actually introduced so far this session, though, and that's Representative Joe Palmer's bill to prohibit cities from putting any limits on things like deposits or fees. And that has been one response that the city of Boise has taken to its affordable housing crunch when you had people applying for lots and lots of apartments and being charged lots of fees. They put a $30 cap on it. There are some limits. This would say they can't do that because, in Representative Palmer's words, it's a business issue. Let's leave it up to business. Essentially, he wants to just let them charge whatever they want.
Yeah, I mean, when it talks about housing, House Bill 442, the bill that Betsy just talked about, is the housing bill that I've seen so far. We were on the radio last week, and I thought Margaret Carmel from Boise Dev did a really good job about talking about what that means if they remove that cap. The city of Boise passed that ordinance, I think it was like 2019, to cap rental application fees at $30. And Margaret, who reports on this closely, talked about if you're looking for an apartment, if you're looking for housing in Boise, you're probably just not paying one application fee, right? You might be paying several application fees, and how that can add up for a working family. But in terms of housing, will it come up this session? Yes, I think it will, and it's something that's on the public's mind. If you go back to that Boise State survey that we've mentioned a couple of times, there's two questions that really address housing being on the public's mind. One of them is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important would you say it is for the Idaho legislature to address each of the following issues? Housing came in fourth. It came in ahead of taxes. 56.9%, basically 57% of Idahoans say something needs to be done on housing and the legislature should do it. And it's a bigger priority for more people than taxes. There's another question. The state of Idaho is on track for a record $1.9 billion surplus. What's the best use of that surplus? Workforce and affordable housing was right up at the top, with increasing teachers' pay and giving tax relief to Idahoans. Those were the top three things that Idahoans said should be done with the surplus. So it's something that's on Idahoans' mind. It's something that's on the public's mind. And I wouldn't be surprised if legislators are working on bills right now. But so far, just the one we've seen had to do with removing, or basically preventing, local governments from capping rental application fees and things like that.
And I should say that there is one other bill that has been introduced, and that was just introduced today, but it is not a major piece of legislation. Representative Tammy Nichols proposed a bill in the House Business Committee today to adjust the law that the legislature previously passed regarding security deposits. And that law set a few statewide strictures on the use of security deposits, including that they be basically placed in a savings account at a bank. Her bill would just adjust that so that they could also be in a credit union, because some Idaho communities don't have a bank, but they have a credit union. So there's one other bill, but it's not very far-reaching.
Let me shift to an education question, and let me answer it and ask it at the same time, or try to do both, since since I write about this stuff too. All-day kindergarten. I look at the tea leaves right now going into this session, when you combine the surplus, and we talked about the Boise State survey and kind of this bipartisan support that the survey found for all-day kindergarten. And I can't see the session ending without an all-day kindergarten bill unless there are so many ideas out there that none get the critical mass and get 36 votes in the House and 18 in the Senate, and and pass muster with the governor. But I think in my heart of hearts, if I had to bet here, we're going to get an all-day kindergarten bill this session. Does anybody want to take an opposing view to me?
I think that would be foolish. You wouldn't put it out there unless you knew. But
No, I haven't.
I think you're right. Heading into the session, that was one of the major points that we heard was the push for all-day kindergarten. Governor Brad Little's education task force called for all-day kindergarten, I think a couple of years ago. The State Board of Education, which members are appointed by the governor, called for all-day kindergarten. As every parent listening today knows, Idaho offers optional half-day kindergarten. The state pays for half-day funding. And so this would be a major policy initiative and a major win. I think back to the late Governor Cecil Andrus and how hard he pushed and for how many terms he pushed for to even get half-day kindergarten.
Half-day kindergarten, which is what we have now.
Into Idaho, which is what we have now. Governor Brad Little kind of set the tone a little bit in the State of the State address, calling for the $47 million to be invested in literacy. His budget lieutenant said that would be enough money to cover the anticipated demand, something like 80% of Idaho families wanting to enroll in optional all-day kindergarten, but he left it open. The money would be, under the governor's proposal, would go through the literacy program. So local school districts could put that money towards all-day kindergarten, or they could put it to a summer reading program or literacy coaches. But I believe there are maybe some members, I think there's some legislators working on an actual proposal to actually bring all-day kindergarten. And it would be a major policy initiative. And I think whether or not it passes, I think it will come forward this year. But it sounded like Melissa was trying to share something right when I started.
I was just going to say, I think the biggest barrier for statewide full-day kindergarten, as we've heard Superintendent Ybarra say, is facilities and staff. We already have a shortage of these two critical things. And so when you add more stresses to the education system like that, it's not that people don't want full-day kindergarten in some of these communities. It's that at some point you need to hire more people and you need more room to put these 5 and 6 year olds. And some of these schools just simply don't have that.
Right.
And
Space is a big deal, especially in a district like West Ada where they're already crowded.
Absolutely. And these are, West Ada is a community that has a lot of resources, and that said, it's also growing. And so there's the ideal that a lot of people want and acknowledge that full-day kindergarten is a great way to set up students for success for their entire educational career. And then there's the reality of the situation where Idaho and the public school system is starting right now, where we're at right now. And these are facilities that are already overcrowded. So, it might not seem like a lot, but you're essentially doubling the kindergarten size in these school districts that have had half-day kindergarten for all of this time. And if those classes are already full, where are you going to put those extra kids? So that's the biggest hurdle that I have heard from people who want full-day kindergarten, but don't necessarily see it happening statewide right away. And that was Superintendent Ybarra's reasoning for saying, you know what, let's start with full-day kindergarten for the highest risk students and have it be optional statewide. I think that's also a lot of the reasoning behind Governor Little's proposal to put was it $47 million into early literacy programs, but have it be optional for the districts on how to use those funds. So I don't think it's necessarily an anti-full-day kindergarten stance. It's looking at the reality of the situation.
It's funny, Melissa, you reminded me of when my daughter was in kindergarten, and her kindergarten class happened to meet in a portable classroom. And the kids loved it because their teacher named it the Kinder Cabin.
And does Eli, the kindergartner in waiting, have a take that he can share with us, or did he go off to watch?
Eli went to play, and now that Dad is done with work for now, that really helps me out. I've got to tell you, This is not ideal. I saw a comment in the chat.
This is not ideal. We live in strange
It's not
times.
ideal. It's not
This
ideal.
is what you come for. This kind of,
I saw a comment in the chat that said, basically the baby on my lap was distracting. I get it. It's not ideal for me either. Okay. But this is the reality of the situation. We haven't been able to find childcare in our area. We're on waiting lists all over the place. We have COVID. We're in isolation. My husband works full time too. And so many parents are dealing with this right now. And so the kindergartner in waiting is going to be a distraction for a while.
yeah, lighten up, guys. The baby in Melissa's lap probably doesn't want to be here either, okay? So let's
He
give them
certainly
all
doesn't
some
want to
grace
have
here,
COVID
okay?
and need all of this comfort.
So I have to say, I had been looking at the chat and I didn't see anything in there. It's in the questions and answers. And so I looked, and there is a comment saying that I should remove my mask because my voice is muffled. Well, I'm in the Capitol Press room and masks are required
Masks are
here. And we've
required.
had some complaints when people don't wear them. So I'm trying to be compliant. I will try to speak up though.
A couple of questions on higher education, and I'm going to kind of combine them here as best I can. One kind of cuts to the chase, and the word treated is really working hard in this question. How will higher education be treated this session? And kind of a related question, why do we think Boise State is being singled out and taking the brunt of the criticism over diversity, equity, inclusion? We saw this in JFAC earlier today with Marlene Tromp making her presentation. Questioner saying, why is it Boise State? Is it location? Is it misogyny? Why is this a Boise State issue? I'll start with you, Betsy. You were there too. You heard it as well.
It's the biggest target. I mean, Boise State has the most students in the state. It's the biggest university. It is clearly the biggest target for any type of criticism about what universities as a whole do. And we have seen this campaign against what's being done, social justice programming, kind of led by Representative Ron Nate from Rexburg, kind of ginning up over the last 2 years. And last year, when it resulted in a reduction in the higher ed budget that JFAC had already passed and approved of $2.5 million, it was not targeted just at Boise State. It was Boise State, University of Idaho, and Idaho State University. All three of them were targeted in that cut, although Boise State took the largest brunt because, once again, they're the biggest target. They have the most students, they have the most classes.
How will universities and higher education be treated? I think it remains to be seen. I think it'll be one of the more interesting, potentially, debates of the season. I think we have to look back at recent legislative history, right? You talked about last session about the Idaho House leading the effort to reduce funding for the budgets that had already been set for higher education, the $2.5 million in the name of indoctrination and social justice teachings. This is something Boise State has been a target since Boise State University President Marlene Tromp walked onto campus in the summer of 2019. State Representative Barbara Ehart, a Republican from Idaho Falls, wrote that letter that 27 or 28 House members signed on to, decrying these, what she termed social justice teachings, social justice institutions at the university.
In fairness,
and
Trump was on the
hasn't let
job
up
for a
then.
whole week and a half before they sent the letter. So they gave her plenty of time to get her feet.
All of that, that was what essentially greeted her when she arrived on campus. What could happen this year? In his State of the State address and budget proposal, Governor Little proposed a 7.1% funding increase for public universities and a 4.8% increase for community colleges. That's sort of where the conversation starts, and I think it'll be interesting in light of the 2021 session and the couple sessions before that, where we've covered it, but you've seen education bills go down. You've seen education budgets go down. And I think that's the recent legislative history that'll be context. And certainly the lieutenant governor had her education task force last summer. And so I think this is on the mind of conservative legislators.
So I think two things to watch for here. Certainly Boise State has been in the thick of this debate, but let's watch what happens on Thursday and Friday. I believe it's Idaho State is before JFAC on Thursday. University of Idaho is before JFAC on Friday. When the legislature cut the higher education budgets, they did cut $500,000 each from Idaho State and U of I for the same reason, this whole social justice issue. So it'll be interesting for me to watch and to see, does Scott Green and does Kevin Satterley get the same kind of line of questioning that we saw Marlene Trump get earlier today? This is a $22 million increase that Governor Little has recommended for higher education. And as far as I can guess, and as far as Alex Adams, the governor's budget guru, can guess, from a pure dollar standpoint, this is the biggest increase higher education would receive in the history of the state. The money is there. Again, when we talk about this $1.9 billion surplus, there's money for, a lot of different things, including $22 million additional for higher education. But this is not going to be a debate about balancing the budget. It's a debate about ideology.
That's right. And in some ways, it's kind of hard to tell what ideology we're really talking about, because last year the focus was on critical race theory, and that we were going to get critical race theory or out of schools and colleges or ban it. The legislature passed House Bill 377. It was signed into law, and it is the law of the state of Idaho. And it says that there are tenets of critical race theory that involve elevating people on the basis of the race and things like that, and that Idaho institutions and schools are forbidden from doing or teaching anything like that or using any state funds to do that. And that's from inculcating and forcing these views onto students. Well, pretty much our education establishment said we never did that. And I thought there were really interesting exchanges between the president of the State Board of Education, Kurt Liebig, and JFAC earlier this week, in which he said, we're listening, and what we tried to do was define these words, figure out what we're talking about. And we've gone out and we've done these surveys, and Representative Nate's response was, but you considered a policy on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the language of critical race theory, so you're already doing it. Well, he's changing the terms partway through the game. And I think Idaho is probably not going to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's basically the motto of every CEO in America right now. Those are accepted workplace principles about how you manage workforces. That's not critical race theory. What is it we're talking about here? In some ways, it goes back to what Kurt Liebig said. We need to define the terms when we have these kinds of debates. And it'll be interesting to see if the state board is able successfully to do that and to persuade the legislators that it has done that. I mean, the legislature in some ways already has defined its terms by passing House Bill 377. And it said, this is what we object to. This is what we don't want to happen. That didn't say there should never be any consideration of diversity, equity, or inclusion. It said basically that Idaho schools should not indoctrinate students in racist, sexist, and other ist things that are offensive. And so I'm not sure exactly where this debate is going. I think that it's possible that Representative Nate and his followers want to push this further and make bigger cuts and attack education on a broader scale. We've certainly heard from the Idaho Freedom Foundation that they don't believe we should have public education. We shouldn't have public schools. We shouldn't have public funding for education. The problem is the Idaho Constitution says that's the number one job of the Idaho legislature, is to provide for the public schools, for free education. So we'll see where this goes.
And
I'll also add that sorry, Kevin.
No, go.
I just want to add that there are so many real challenges facing higher education in Idaho and across the nation right now. President Cynthia Pemberton today from Lewis and Clark State College said that career technical education enrollment is down, as normally happens with times of low unemployment. Recruitment for people to work at the university, whether they are in instructor positions or support positions, is difficult because of pay. The cost for tuition. I mean, these are all incredibly critical issues that are facing higher ed in Idaho right now. And all of the higher ed people I've spoken to said that this discussion, this debate, that really not many people are that concerned about, is a distraction from what they are very concerned about.
I was glad Betsy a minute ago mentioned the Idaho Freedom Foundation, because one of the things I found really interesting about Kurt Liebeck's comments, and I don't know if anybody else listened closely on Monday, he spoke at length and passionately about how he believes that there are forces trying to undermine the education system, that they're trying to dismantle public education. He doesn't understand the end game. He doesn't understand their objective. And he said the state board needs to change the narrative. And I felt like I was watching the $20,000 pyramid, where you're giving hints, but you're not saying, how do you talk about the Freedom Foundation without mentioning the Freedom Foundation, which felt like what Kurt Liebeck was trying to do there on Monday. But I'm curious, all three of you, that's a group that has a lot of legislators on their side, especially on the House side, but we're starting to see maybe more, spoken or unspoken pushback against the Freedom Foundation and its agenda. And I'm just curious about how all three of you view this.
Well, I thought that Kurt Liebeck's message was pretty clear. And
No, it wasn't.
It was not a message coming from, some progressive Democrat. He was pretty clearly, a wood products executive, an Idaho guy coming in and saying plainly, hey, this stuff's nuts. Here's what we need to do. We need to figure out what's going on here, and we need to provide for our schools and our systems and so on. It seemed fairly common sense, and I think it has a good sell. On the other hand, the Freedom Foundation is closely allied with the group that's launched a conservative agenda, and I believe they said they were up to 31 legislators signing on to their agenda this year. That's a fair number.
It's almost enough to kill a higher education bill on the House floor. I mean, it's almost enough votes to kill a higher education budget. We've seen that before.
We have indeed.
Melissa, Clark? Freedom Foundation? Yes.
I think that there's a lot of support for the agenda. I have seen more and more pushback against the tactics, quite frankly, especially social media and online tactics. But as far as the goals and the agenda, I don't think that's unpopular at all, especially in the House.
Yeah, I mean, I think she's right. This is a group that used a lot of aggressive tactics in the last 2 years during the pandemic. And excuse my language, but to the Freedom Foundation talked about our healthcare workers bitching and moaning at one point. That turned off a lot of Idahoans. That turned off a lot of Idaho business owners. I talked to a lot of conservative Republicans in the first 3 weeks of this session who told me they were proud of their D rating from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, that they don't need to be pushed around by these people. And so I think it's a divisive group that thrives on dividing people. But at the same time, I think they do have influence, particularly within the right wing of the Idaho Republican Party. But it's a group that's come on the record saying the state doesn't need to be involved in the public education business, despite a constitutional mandate to do that. And it's a group that used some pretty extreme tactics over the last 2 years that alienated a lot of Idahoans and alienated a lot of Idaho business leaders and businesses. But still, heading into a closed Republican primary, I expect to be a big factor.
We have 12 minutes left. We haven't really talked about elections yet, and I think we have to and want to talk about elections. We've got several questions about the primary, and I'll kind of combine a couple here. One questioner wondering, what is Brad Little doing, and what is the strategy behind not announcing for governor when it's fairly clear from his fundraising that he is running for governor? And a related question, and I'll sanitize the wording a little bit. What is up with Janice McGeehan?
I mean, I think what Brad Little is doing is running for re-election without saying he's running for re-election, right? He's raised more money than he had 4 years ago. I believe he's raised more money than the other gubernatorial candidates in the Republican primary. He may be trying to distance himself between some of the back and forth between him and Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeehan, like you alluded to try and take some of the politics out of it. We do anticipate that the filing deadline, or at least right now, it's scheduled to open in February 28th. Right. But I think what he's doing is running for governor quietly and behind the scenes. I think he's raising to paraphrase one of my favorite budget analysts, a boatload of money. And I think he may be trying to distance himself between, because that got national attention, right? Some of the conflict between the governor would leave the state and the lieutenant governor would step in and issue an executive order. I think some people could view that as embarrassing. I think some people could view that as a distraction. And he may be trying to distance himself from some of that. But it looks like the campaign is off and well, even though it hasn't officially been declared.
And of course, the Lieutenant Governor, Janice McGean, is taking the exact opposite tactic. She is running hard and running out front in front of our eyes, to the point that last night on TV, I saw her first campaign ad and I was quite stunned. It's early and it was a President Trump endorsement ad and it was pretty slick. I saw it on both Channel 7 and Channel 2. The campaign is afoot and the lieutenant governor is pushing it as hard as she can, as early as she can, at the same time that the governor pushes it off. And in some ways, that allows him to get the free publicity from just doing his job. And because the governor has a job to do during the legislative session. But he's raised more than $1 million in the last year, and he's probably going to want to start spending some of that pretty soon if she is spending hers against him.
And frankly, in a lot of the official business, it comes across as campaigning. There's campaign language dating back all the way to the executive order that repealed Lieutenant Governor McGehan's executive order when he was out of town in May 2021. I mean, and we had asked them about this on Idaho Reports, where, at what point does this become campaigning on the clock? And, he basically said, you try and separate as much as you can, but when you're an incumbent, you run on your record. And, right now, Idaho has among the lowest unemployment. We have one of the strongest economies by many measures. And so I don't see any downside strategically from him waiting to officially announce. The other races I'm curious about, right? Superintendent is a perfect example. Sherry Ybarra hasn't yet announced. And that's going to be a very interesting Republican primary, not to mention the general.
Well, Melissa, you make a really good point about, there's always going to be a little bit of a blurred line between government business and campaigning. I mean, the State of the State address was not without political talking points. I mean, the audience that the governor was speaking to on January 10th was not just the legislators in the House Rotunda. I mean, it was a pretty clear message to potential voters. But let's talk about some of these other races, because you mentioned the superintendent's race, Melissa, and I'm not sure what Sherry Ybarra is doing, and I cover education. I'm not sure what her objective is. She's raising some money. She's never raised a lot of money in past campaigns.
But she's raised almost $20,000 in the past year. I just looked at the reports this week.
Which,
and for her, that's kind of a lot.
It is kind of a lot for her. She is a notoriously, she notoriously does not raise a lot of money for campaigns. She's a very unusual, unorthodox campaigner. Debbie Critchfield has raised well over $150,000 last I checked. And Brandon Durst has probably outraised Sherry Ybarra based on what I've checked. I mean, those are, I haven't checked the numbers very recently, but I wonder what's going on in that race. And let's talk about the lieutenant governor's primary too. I don't see House Speaker Bedke around here anymore.
He was here earlier.
He was here. Bye, Mr. Speaker. See you later. How do you assess this race so far? Because this is one race, maybe even more so than the gubernatorial race, where it's getting personal very quickly.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think the lieutenant governor's race became interesting when Luke Malik dropped out of the race, right? He was one of the first, maybe the first candidate I saw to get involved with the race, and he got out of it, endorsed Speaker of the House Scott Bedke to run against State Representative Priscilla Giddings. I mean, right from even the campaign kickoffs last year in that race, they kicked off early and they were bizarre. We had Speaker Bedke's kickoff at the State Capitol building. Some of Representative Giddings' supporters tried to surround them and push their signs in front of them, and it was just a weird event. But I think that race got a lot more interesting with Luke Malik dropping out and endorsing Bedke. But it's again, like when you look at the 2022 elections heading into the primaries, I see candidates from the far right side of the spectrum on the Republican Party really going all in for higher offices, looking at the governor's race with Lieutenant Governor McGeehan running, looking at the Lieutenant Governor's race with State Representative Priscilla Giddings running, and then on down the line. So I think that's an interesting one, and it's another race of sort of more establishment type Republicans versus receiving a challenge on the right from a more conservative candidate running for statewide office. And as far as the superintendent's race, I mean, covering 2 terms of superintendent of public instruction, Sherry Ybarra with you. I mean, the one thing Superintendent Ybarra always told me is that she will not behave like a traditional candidate. And boy, did she back that up over the last 8 years. So I don't know what's going to happen, but Debbie Critchfield, the former State Board of Education president, has done the opposite. It has been campaigning for a long time, raised a lot of money, and has like a full staff up and running, right, Kevin? Which we don't really see at those levels of races for the state of Idaho. So she's really got some campaign infrastructure. She had some name recognition going in through serving on the State Board of Education. That's an interesting race for sure. But I think 2022, one of the stories is candidates from the far right making a push for higher office.
But also beyond that.
Well, I was going to say exactly what Clark is talking about is what's going on, for example, in the Idaho Attorney General's race, where we have the longest serving Republican Attorney General, or longest serving Attorney General at all in Idaho history, Lawrence Wasden, being challenged by Raul Labrador in the Republican primary. That's been a sleeper race thus far, but that is exactly the dynamic that Clark is talking about. And then we've got an open race for Secretary of State with multiple Republicans jostling for that position. 2 sitting legislators, Representative Dorothy Moon, Senator Mary Souza, and Ada County Clerk Phil McGrain. And that's an active race.
And you mentioned the AG's race is a sleeper race, but on the other hand, Raul Labrador is raising a lot of money and raising a lot of money very quickly. I mean, I'm interested, Labrador and Critchfield, even though ideologically they may be quite different, they're doing exactly the same thing that you're doing if you're a challenger. In Labrador's case, definitely running against an incumbent. In Critchfield's case, presuming that she's running against an incumbent. You raise money, you make a splash, you show the political world that you're serious about running a race.
It's also not all about the fundraising. You know, remember back in 2014, there was a 4-way race for Republican superintendent nominee. Sherry Ybarra raised the least amount of money by far, didn't travel much while she was campaigning, and still won that race. So the fundraising and the active campaigning, when you have a crowded primary, especially when it's a close primary, doesn't always translate to an automatic victory. We've seen that a number of times over the years. Lieutenant Governor Republican primary in 2018 is another example.
Can get unpredictable with no incumbent.
It definitely can be. We've got about 2 minutes left. You've all given us great insights. What is the one thing we haven't talked about so far that may unfold between now and May that people should keep an eye on? Really quickly, lightning round. Something we haven't talked about.
They're putting an emergency clause on every single bill, but it says that it'll go into effect at the regular time, July 1st. That's because they're worried that the legislature may not adjourn more than 60 days before July 1st, as it did last year. I sure hope that's not what's happening, but that is something we're seeing.
Yeah, I think
major investments. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Clark.
Just real quick, whether the House will adjourn sine die in March or April, or whether they'll take another recess, I'd look for conservative Republicans to maybe try to take another recess again, and I'll let Melissa finish it off.
I think there's a lot of rallying behind major investments for infrastructure, and not just transportation, even though that's incredibly critical, but things like broadband infrastructure. And that is going to help things like working remotely, healthcare access, which is huge for rural communities, distance learning, so many different things. You're also going to see, I think, a rallying behind investment in healthcare infrastructure. You know, everything from the VA home and updates to bring it up to date, to looking at how we can recruit and retain more medical students and keep them here in Idaho to address those huge gaps that we have in some areas between physician and resident ratios.
Well, y'all, it's been a great hour of discussion and conversation, and this is always fun, whether we do it virtually or in person or whatever this is. I thank you all for your time. Betsy, Melissa, you've gotten these before, and you're not even here to get one. So I don't make the rules, but Clark, you get one of these coveted City Club mugs as a first-time pundit. Betsy Russell, Melissa Davlin, Clark Corbin, thank you all for taking the time, and thank you all for taking the time to listen to us.